Okay, how were we framed? Identity Unframed episode, I don't know, it's probably about 10 at this point, but the question I've been grappling with is how were we framed? Seriously, how were we framed? Because I think framing is everything when we think about identity. We talk about identity like it's something that we just simply discover. I mean, seriously, but a lot of us were introduced to ourselves through somebody else's definition of who we were supposed to be. Whether it was our families, our cultures, our neighborhoods, our schools, our religion, our race, our socioeconomic circumstance, our professions, accomplishments, and the list goes on and on. Even the things that happened to us shaped our identity. And all of those things become part of our frame. And eventually some of those things become so deeply embedded in us that we just stop seeing them as a frame and we call them who we are. So I've been thinking a lot about Erik Erikson recently and his work around identity versus role confusion. Erikson identified adolescence as a particularly important part of identity development. And I agree with him, but I think we have to push that conversation a little bit further because all of us didn't get that equal opportunity. Because identity doesn't stop developing when we graduate high school. Our identities can continue to evolve through young adulthood, through midlife, through career changes, relationships, parenthood, loss, success, failure, and all types of transitions throughout our lives. And that makes sense to me because some of us reach midlife and realize something really uncomfortable. We may have become incredibly successful at being somebody we never fully stopped to examine. I know I have to wrestle with that. It takes me back to 2002. I graduated from college with a business degree. I had been told that I was going to take a job in finance on the Gulf Coast. The plan was simple: get the degree, get the job, make the money, build the life. A plus B always equals C, right? Except 9/11 had happened. The economy was trying to recover and that job just never materialized. And suddenly something that I spent years preparing for all of a sudden was no longer available to me. I remember driving 10 hours back to Chicago, listening to Common's Electric Circus album and crying at the same time. I had graduated, I had done everything that the frame told me to do, but the frame didn't account for the world changing. And that's when I started to understand something. A frame isn't necessarily bad because sometimes that frame saves us. Because I grew up with instability and education became a pathway for me. It represented opportunity, but it also presented something much more basic, which was stability, a place to go, a way forward. So I learned how to succeed inside of that frame. Despite the job itself not materializing, I was able to become a teacher, a school leader, then a principal. I earned another degree, then another one. I went through leadership development. I didn't stop there. I did school turnaround work. I spent almost 2 decades inside of education and I was good at it. But eventually I had to confront something. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life being a traditional educator. I wanted to impact communities. I wanted to tell stories. I wanted to build. I wanted to see potential in people and help them do something with that potential. And I realized I had been screened for something that I was qualified to do, but nobody really stopped and saw me and asked, what is he capable of becoming? I don't want to say that with any kind of resentment because those years were simply not a waste. They built me, they gave me relationships, they gave me credibility, gave me stories, gave me scars, gave me perspective. But I'm gonna tell you what was most important about those years. They gave me evidence that becoming successful and becoming fully expressed are not necessarily the same thing. And I think a lot of us eventually run into that realization, not because we did something wrong, but because the identity that helped us get here may not be the identity that's going to take us to where we know we need to go next. And I think that's where midlife gets really interesting, because by the time we get here, we've experienced enough life to start seeing the difference. We've carried responsibility, we've raised kids, led organizations, we've taken care of parents. I mean, the list could go on and on and on in terms of all of the things that we have done in life. I mean, heck, we've made money, we've lost money, we failed, we've watched things not work. We've accumulated enough experience to ask a different kind of question, not just who am I, but who have I been framed to be? That's a very different question, because maybe the identity we built was exactly what we needed at 25. Maybe it helped us survive. Maybe it helped us belong. Maybe it helped us to succeed. But what happens when the world changes? What happens when our career changes? What happens when our families change? Our priorities need to change. And what happens when we just change? And this is where I think we have to talk about the work that we do on ourselves. Therapy is incredible. It can be incredibly valuable. It can help us to recognize patterns. It can help us to understand where those patterns actually came from. It can help us name things that we couldn't name before. So it gives us the language that we need to articulate it. But at some point, insight has to become application, because we can understand the pattern and still live inside of it. We can understand the frame and still decide to participate in it. And sometimes the work isn't just about figuring out what's wrong with us. Sometimes the work is asking whether the identity we've built is still big enough for the people that we know we've got to become. I've had to ask myself these same questions. It's like, I know I can be an author. I know I can be a public speaker. I know I can tell stories. I'm supposed to tell somebody's story. And yet, with all the responsibility being thrown even at me as an adult, it's incredibly easy to keep putting those things off. And I think a lot of us know what that feels like. It's like we look around, we see our peers, we see people doing things that we know we're capable of doing. And sometimes those feelings don't just disappear. They start showing up in conversations, in our relationships, in our work, in the way that we see ourselves. Because eventually the distance between who we know we can become and who we're allowing ourselves to be starts to create real tension. So maybe that's where Identity Unframed begins, not with changing everything, not with throwing away the lives that we have built. It's not like we're going to pretend that the past didn't matter, but it begins with reflection, with looking at the current situation and the current version of ourselves and asking, what frame are we living inside? Who gave it to us? And what did that frame help us to survive? And what did it help us to accomplish? But the most important question, is it big enough for who we're becoming? Because maybe the next version of us doesn't require throwing away everything that we've built. Maybe it requires understanding the frame that helped us build it. Maybe it requires loosening the frame, redesigning the frame, and maybe for the first time deciding what actually belongs in that picture. And if you're in that space right now, I'm probably in there with you, because I'm not standing outside of this conversation. I'm inside of it. I'm still figuring out what belongs in my frame. I'm still figuring out what I've carried because it was necessary, what I've carried because it was familiar, what had to be carried simply because I never stopped to question it. And maybe that's the conversation that you and I need to have. And this is not somebody telling you what to become or who to become, but somebody willing to get into the mix with you and just ask a few provocative questions. And that's Identity Unframed. How are we framed?